So, good evening everyone and welcome to the first ACO Video Diary. So we're going to be producing lots of these through the season, so you get to know a little bit more about us, a little bit more about the music we're playing. But today I wanted to start by talking about the music for our first concert. That's Brahms' Second Symphony in D major. Before I do though, I wanted to answer an FAQ that I always get as a conductor, which is, what does a score look like? So I've got my Brahms here with me that I've been studying all afternoon, and I thought I'd just give you a look at those two pages. Because what often surprises people is when they have a look at a score that they find out that every single instrument of the orchestra is there printed on the page. No abbreviations, no condensing the material into like a piano part or something like that. It's the whole thing that we see at any one time. And that gives you a little bit of insight into what the difficulties of conducting are. And it often leads to the second most frequent question that I get asked, which is, how do you do that? How do you read all that stuff at the same time? And there's two keys to it, for me anyway. And the first is, we have to get very good as conductors at condensing, at summarizing the material almost subconsciously. So when we look at a score, we see, okay, there's an instrument over here, and then there's an instrument way down the page, but they're playing exactly the same line, they're playing exactly the same melody, so I'm going to think of them as one thing. And then, okay, there are some instruments over here, some instruments over here, and they're playing together, and they're just forming this one chord of, let's say, A major, D flat minor. So again, all of those instruments we kind of compact into just one idea in our heads. And when we've grouped everything up like that, we can start to read the whole thing, however complicated it is. Of course, the other thing is, and actually I've got a perfect example of it right here. Here we go. This is Mahler's Sixth Symphony, which is another thing I'm doing. So Brahms is quite a bit earlier than Mahler. So he wrote for kind of medium-sized orchestras, whereas Mahler, writing at the turn of the 20th century, is writing for huge orchestras. So that's the beginning of the third movement. And as you can see, all of those lines are just one single melody. Okay, so all of these are just playing at the same time, and this is one line of music. So you can see it gets massively complicated, and no amount of summarizing on the fly can help you with that kind of stuff. And what you just really have to do is you have to sit there at home preparing the score, building it up line by line, starting off by getting familiar with the melody, then maybe adding in the bass line. You can see some of the accompaniments, some of the counter melodies, till you can kind of grasp in your mind the whole thing in one go. And it's slow, and it's often frustrating, but when you get there in the end, it's incredibly rewarding when you can picture this whole piece in your mind just from looking at the page. So anyway, back to Brahms. You'll quite often hear musicians say, oh, Brahms is one of the hardest composers to realize, to perform well. And what I wanted to have a look at is, why is that? Because actually I think in those difficulties, in those challenges that we face as performers, lie some of the things that make Brahms so amazing. So anyway, what I think people are talking about when they talk of how hard it is to perform this music well, they're talking about the line. That simply means the storyline of the piece. Now, to take something perhaps a little more familiar to everyone, if you take a huge book like, let's say, The Lord of the Rings, that's a great example. It's thousands of pages long. What you get in that book that makes it so perfect is two things. You always have the feeling that you're going somewhere. There is this momentum, even though you know the climax of this story is thousands of pages away. Nonetheless, wherever you are, you always feel like you're going towards that climax. And at the same time, what you get is every page is just sort of sparkling with detail. You have characters and colours and sights and smells. You really feel like you're in the moment in each and every sentence. And that's the genius of a book like that, is that you can do both. You get the detail and the line, and neither of them interrupt each other. And it's exactly the same thing, it's exactly the same problem in Brahms. We have to do both. We have to find a way to make each little melody incredibly beautiful and really moving, and yet at the same time not disrupt the line that Brahms is after, which is this huge sweeping paragraph after paragraph that goes on for pages and pages without interruption, or at least it should be without interruption, and it's our job as the performer to try and work out how we're going to do that. So Brahms does help us along the way with some things. So quite often, if you come to next week's concert, you'll hear, if you listen very carefully, as one melody is ending, so another one begins, and they're overlapped. The join is not obvious. He just kind of puts them one over the other. So we never notice that actually one shape has come to the end and another's beginning. That's a really common one that you'll hear all the time. The other one is Brahms really avoids punctuation, really clear punctuation, like the plague. So we have these things called cadences, which are essentially our version of full stops and colons, commas. They're the way we group and end lines and phrases of music. So Brahms will always avoid cadences that sound final. And just when we think we're going to some huge climax, he'll change direction at the last minute with some unexpected little cadence that takes us off in a completely new direction and never lets us get to that high point that we thought we were going to reach. So I think with a little bit of magic I might be able to play you one now. This is from the first movement, and it really feels like we're reaching the pinnacle of the piece, but actually with this really clever cadence, just to a solo flute and a solo clarinet, we slowly descend back to the music we actually began the whole piece with. So not only do we not get that climax, we actually go right back to where we began. So as you can see, Brahms definitely helps us out a lot with all of these little compositional tricks and devices, but still there's a huge amount for us to do as performers. So every performer, be they violinist, conductor, they're going to have different ways of tackling these problems. So it's completely individual, there's no set way, but I just wanted to share a few of the things I'm trying at the moment. Because again, even for each individual person, it changes over time, the way they like to look at these things and break them down. So the first thing is something completely new that I learned from another conductor while I was working in America over the summer. So this is a little roadmap that I've started making for each movement of the piece. I hope you can see that. If you're eagle-eyed, you're going to see that this is actually from Mahler 6, but this is just the one I have to hand. So if you can see, what I've done basically is I've marked out the different sections of the piece. So each little line and the bar number and a little bit of text represents the start of a different major section of the piece. And what I've been doing is, as I've been looking through the score, going through it in my mind, studying it, I've kind of had this just to one side. Just something I can see out of the corner of my mind. And what I'm finding it does is it helps me understand where in this story I am. And what that does is it kind of gives me an understanding of how much I should indulge, how much time I should be taking, whether I need to keep going, because you know I'm still near the beginning, I've got miles to go, and if I stop now it's going to be really hard to pick it up again. It gives me this real sense of essentially how much I can linger and dwell on each part of the music, and also always kind of where I'm going to next. And then when I really get there, where the major climaxes of this piece are, where I can really go to town and give everything I've got. And conversely, the places where I have to save a little bit maybe, even though the music is saying loud, maybe it's not quite as loud as something that's coming up, so I know I have to just keep a lid on it a little bit. And on those lines, the other thing I wanted to show you is, here we go, it's back to Brahms. Another thing I do is I put these little numbers in the corners of the pages each time it's the beginning of a new sort of phrase of music. And what they do is they just, again, in a slightly smaller way, they help me to understand where I am. So for example, maybe there it was 4 plus 4 plus 4. So I know there's one sentence of music built up of three little parts. Each one of them's 4 bars long. And what I find is when I get to the start of each sentence, I have this real confidence just from looking at that little figure, exactly where I am, exactly how long the phrase is, exactly where it's going to, where it's coming from. And then maybe when I get stuff like a crescendo, so i.e. a marking to get louder, and let's say I know I have to get louder for 6 bars precisely, I have the ability to judge that perfectly. If I just see crescendo and I sort of know how long it is, maybe I'll arrive at the top, at the loudest point of that crescendo too early. Maybe I'll never get there in time. But when I have these little bar markings, these little numbers, I find it really easy to pace each of these things. And what I find that helps me do is it helps me to put in all of this detail, but in such a way or in such proportions that I'm never losing this overarching flow. So anyway, I hope that's a little bit of insight, a little bit of interesting sort of conductor knowledge, or conductor problems, I say, for Brahms' Second Symphony. And we really look forward to seeing you on 10th of October and sharing this amazing piece with you.